The Ermac Centre is proud to present the SFU Fellows of the Royal Society of Canada Seminar Series. This bi-weekly series hosts 5 presentations per semester. For the Spring 2012 semester, the presenters belong to the Departments of Earth Sciences, English, Biological Sciences, Economics, and the School of Resource and Environmental Management. Today's speaker is Dr. Lawrence Boland from the Department of Economics.
So in 1966, Lawrence Boland joined the Department of Economics. Turns out when you do the math, that's a long time. I was basically, my jaw hit the desk. And it's very clear, I think, that given that length of spectacular service, that the introduction should be about half an hour long. But I know that Larry has a lot of very interesting things to say, so I'll just keep it short. At least short by my normal standards. Larry received a BSc in economics from Bradley University in 1962, and then an MSc and later a PhD in 1966 from the University of Illinois. His primary teaching area has been microeconomic theory and methodology at both the undergraduate and the graduate level. His current research concerns the knowledge and learning assumptions commonly used in economic models. He was elected to the Royal Society in 2001. As a former chair of the department and important member of Senate, I mean, anybody that's been around here would know Larry from Senate, and certainly a longtime chair in the economics department. He has played a big role in building our department and the university. He is a person that I've gone to many times over the years for his administrative expertise and wisdom. He has published 6 books, including The Foundations of Economic Method, A Popperian Perspective, The Principles of Economics, Some Lies My Teachers Told Me. I was never his teacher. He may have been mine, actually, at some point. The Methodology of Economic Model Building, Methodology after Samuelson, and others. He's also published over 70 articles on theory and methodology. This is a huge number by economic standards. It wouldn't surprise a scientist, but it's a very, very big number for economists. He's published in some of the best journals in economics as well. So for example, he has a critique on Friedman's critics in the Journal of Economic Literature. He also has many other papers, but another one on the futility of criticizing the neoclassical maximization hypothesis, which appeared in the AER. So please join me in welcoming Lawrence Boland to the stage.
I've never lectured. I'm not a lecturer like my friend Richard. I've never lectured in 46 years of teaching, so I'm not good at this, so I'm going to read a paper. I hope that doesn't bother everybody. I have a bunch of my students here, and they will testify to how poor I would do if I were a lecturer. My field of research has been the study of methodology. That is the study of how economists go about doing economics. For North America, such a field of research is considered rather a strange pursuit. Fortunately, elsewhere in the world, it is sometimes considered worthy of consideration, and at least for the next 40 minutes maybe here as well. Today I wish to talk about methodology and about ideology. From the beginning of my career in economics, I have been interested in why economists assume what they assume. My PhD thesis was about the most popular methodological concern of the 1960s, specifically the view that to be taken seriously, mathematical models must be testable. A lot of people then mistakenly thought this was due to the writings of the philosopher of science, Karl Popper. This mistake was quite common, but specifically the concern was not due to Popper. Instead, it was due to the work of the famous economic theorist Paul Samuelson. His concern for testability was a response to the critics of the use of mathematics in the development of economic theory. That is to say, in the 1930s, the critics thought that all one could ever get from building mathematical models would be tautologies. Tautologies, of course, are necessarily untestable as a matter of logic. And so if one can derive a testable proposition from one's economic model, then one has proven the critics wrong. Samuelson set about doing just this in his famous PhD thesis. As he stated in this book, he would always have testability in mind when building his economic models. Unlike Samuelson, I, of course, did not receive a Nobel Prize for my PhD thesis, but mine was also concerned with testability of economic models. At the time, I naively thought economic model builders were not just talking about the logical problem of testability, but instead, I thought they were actually talking about the process of collecting sufficient empirical data to perform a test of a model. What I was able to show was that even in simple Keynesian models, the number of observations necessary to test a model far exceeded what was realistically possible in the real world. One particular example stood out. I showed that any model that assumes its production function is Cobb-Douglas informed can require 250,000 observations to form just one refuting observation. Now, ideology was not the concern of Samuelson's PhD, nor was it of mine. Today, however, those who see themselves engaged in developing so-called heterodox economics may admit that they are deliberately attempting to engage mainstream economists in ideological issues. But whenever you ask young model builders in the mainstream of economics why they assume what they do, their answers usually involve only technical mathematical matters, or simply they answer because that's what everyone does. And so rarely would they claim that their assumptions were guided by ideological concerns. Nevertheless, too often, ideological implications are assured by the assumptions mainstream economists make, even if they are unaware of such implications. Of course, sometimes mainstream model builders are consciously promoting ideology with their assumptions, but from what I have encountered, this is not the usual case. But in either case, such implications are what I want to talk about today. When I began teaching microeconomic theory in the 1960s and then continuing through the 1970s, many students at SFU were motivated by their sociology teachers, these were teachers who actively promoted Marxism, although few of them ever read Marx, of course. When I was teaching an economics principles class, I particularly remember spending a lot of our class time explaining the virtues of the market system. But by the 1980s, things dramatically changed. Then and for the next few years, I had to explain to my first-year economics students the possible virtues of government involvement in the economy. In both cases, I was dealing with the ideological concerns and propaganda rather than well-thought-out economic theories. But at least during that time, such concerns were put on the table for open discussion. Of course, some economic students may still explicitly presume that the market can solve all problems, explicitly being the word. Nevertheless, among economic students today, economics is no longer controversial, or is it seen in ideological terms? Certainly not as it was in the early 1980s. That is to say, today's students simply presume everyone agrees that the market can solve all problems, and thus there is no need to consider government involvement, nor any need to examine such a presumption. This situation will be something I will try to explain today. As I said, my concern as a methodologist is understanding why model builders assume what they do. As such, I am only interested in what Deirdre McCluskey called small m methodology questions. I am definitely not interested in the big M methodology questions that economic philosophers typically pursue. In this regard, I have argued for many years that the most interesting methodological problems are caused by what we take for granted, particularly when making assumptions. Let me illustrate these issues at hand by considering a few of the assumptions often taken for granted when building economic models. Do we assume all prices are equilibrium prices? Do we assume only individuals make decisions? That is, things don't decide, only people do? Do we assume that all decision makers have sufficient knowledge to guarantee that their choices will maximize profit or utility, etc.? Are all decision makers maximizers, or are they satisficers, as my late friend Herb Simon would have us assume? Do all production functions exhibit constant returns to scale? Does every indifference curve form a border of a strictly convex preferred set? Are all production functions continuously differentiable? Do all investors respond to lowered interest rates? Or similarly, do demanders always buy more when the price drops? Do all game players know all the rules of the game? Or even do all players in any specific game see the game in the same way? And so on. You get the idea. There are a lot of assumptions one must make to build a model or to form and justify any model recommendations. And of course, policy recommendation, I said model recommendation, that was policy recommendations. Of course, policy recommendations are obviously sensitive to assumptions we make, but rarely do proponents of a policy ever tell you everything they have assumed. Before going on, I think I need to be explicit about some simple elementary facts of logic and realism. By elementary logic, I'm only talking about basic explanations, whereby one provides reasons for why some explicit statement about an observed event or some predicted event is true. What we rely on for such an explanation is the inherent property of any logically valid argument. This property has a name, modus ponens. This inherent property says that every logically valid argument consists of a conjunction of statements, that is, a conjunction of what we call assumptions. And whenever all of the assumptions are true, then necessarily any statement that can be logically deduced using these assumptions must also be true. If it turns out that one of these deduced statements does not fit the observed, then we know that at least one of our assumptions must be false. That is, at least one of our presumptions is unrealistic. Now, I'm very sure everyone here knows all about this elementary logic stuff, but it's always amazing how so many economists have the notion that whenever they can deduce a lot of observed true statements from their model, that the observed realism of those deductions somehow tells them something about the realism of their model and its assumptions. But as a matter of elementary logic, this common notion is simply false. You cannot work backward from the observed truth of one's deductions to the guaranteed truth of status of the assumptions used to form those deductions. And similarly, if you know one of your assumptions is not true, you do not thereby have the right to claim that any of your deductions, other than the statements themselves, which use the assumption are false. For those of you who might disagree with me on all this, let me give you a simple example to illustrate. Consider the following assumptions for a syllogism that would be used to explain why my house pet was a cat. If it is true that all cats have 5 legs, that first one's not necessary, and that only cats have 5 legs, and that my pet has 5 legs, then it must be true that my pet was a cat. Of course, all 3 assumptions are false, yet the logically derived conclusion is in fact true. Stated another way, in matter of elementary logic, even though one of our deductions from the assumptions is true, it is still the case that all of our assumptions can be false. So clearly, just because our model can logically explain an observably true statement, such a logical success tells us nothing about the realism of our model's assumptions. This brings us to where all of this mattered for modern economists, namely Milton Friedman's famous 1953 essay, The Methodology of Positive Economics. His essay prompted a long list of critiques, yet it still had and still continues to have many adherents. However, the critiques of it were not trivial, as they were authored by some of the biggest names in economics. For example, the Nobel Prize winners Paul Samuelson, Tollings Koopmans, and Herbert Simon, as well as many other big names of the day. In almost every case, the published critiques unfairly involved redefining the words test or testing in ways not intended by Milton, and then they all go on to criticize their unfair version of Milton's essay. As such, I think this type of unfair criticism is ineffective, even though, particularly in the case of Samuelson's critique, many of those who rejected Milton's ideology or his economic policy recommendations eagerly accepted Samuelson's critique as successful. As some of you may know, and then Gordy pointed it out, I published an article about these critiques in 1979. My purpose was to clear the deck of ineffective and logically defective critiques so that an effective and logically valid critique could be formed. It is always interesting and puzzling to me that so many readers of my article think I was defending Milton and his essay. That certainly was neither my purpose nor what I said in my article, but I guess that at one level, and for purely logical reasons, it is easy for someone who accepts any critique of Milton's essay to not care whether the critique is actually unfair. Similarly, for ideological reasons, anyone who wants to be armed so as to be able to fend off the various popular critiques will like to think my article is a sufficient defense of Milton's essay. But if all these readers would actually read my 1979 article to its last page, they will see that I offered a logically adequate and fair critique of Milton's essay. My criticism of Milton's 1953 essay was merely presenting an argument for what some philosophers call instrumentalism. However, I was arguing in response to all the critics of this essay that its only defense would be to invoke instrumentalism itself, a consistent defense maybe, but a certainly circular one at best. Instrumentalism has a long history, going back at least to the beginning of the 18th century when Bishop Berkeley attempted to corral the growing interest in Newton's mechanics. The problem he was addressing was that some philosophers were using Newton's theory to claim it as possible to prove that the church was no longer needed to truly understand the heavens and earth. Berkeley simply argued that Newton's theory should be considered merely tools or instruments for measuring and predicting such things as the movements of the planet, and as such, they need not be considered true or even competitors for the universal truths Berkeley thought were the responsibility of the church. In this regard, Friedman argued that the only test of a tool is whether or not it works, and if it works, one need not worry about whether it is a true representation of reality. To illustrate this apparent denial of the need to worry about realism, I usually refer to the situation facing any typical TV repairman. When we take our failing TV to the repairman, we do not quiz the repairman to determine if he understands the latest theories of electromagnetism. For all we know, he may believe there are little green men in the transistors and TV has failed merely because one of the little green men has died. So long as he replaces the appropriate transistor with the supposedly little green man, of course, and the TV works, we're happy. In other words, instrumentalism just says that so long as one's theory works, it does not matter that it employs false assumptions. The question seldom considered is, can you honestly claim to understand some phenomenon if your understanding is based on known false assumptions? Unfortunately, this question rarely comes up, so I guess I will leave it and move on. While there are many methodologists today who still want to argue about Friedman's essay, that is not my purpose here. I raise the notion of instrumentalism for discussion because despite their public denial of ever agreeing with this essay, many economic model builders today still invoke instrumentalism to justify their use of patently unrealistic assumptions. In my 1997 book, I recounted a relevant event that took place in 1983 at a 1983 Cambridge University conference celebrating Keynes's 100th birthday. At the end of the conference, I had the fortunate opportunity to do a survey of some Keynesian econometricians about their view of methodology. I outlined for them the fundamental notions of Friedman's instrumentalism, but without ever mentioning his name. When I asked who in the group agreed with these fundamental notions, all of the econometricians held up their hands. When I then asked who among them agreed with Friedman's methodology, being all Keynesians, of course, they all denied any agreement with Friedman's instrumentalist methodology. Was this inconsistency evidence of hypocrisy or mere mere ignorance of methodology? As I will explain today, it continues to be a common problem with econometricians and other model builders who seem completely unaware of the implication of what they take for granted when it comes to methodology. The econometrician David Henry long ago observed that too often econometric model builders make assumptions with their left hand to build their underlying model, but with their right hand they apply theorems from econometric theory that are inconsistent with the model's assumptions. And this dual perspective is what's driving what I want to talk about today. There has been an ongoing debate among a few methodologists as to whether Friedman's 1953 essay, Instrumentalism essay, is responsible for our excessive and growing dependence on using heavy-duty mathematics to build models. That debate does not seem relevant to me, particularly given my old survey of the Keynesian econometricians. I would think few of today's young economic model builders have ever read Milton's essay. Moreover, the early promoters of the use of mathematics, such as Paul Samuelson, actually rejected Milton's essay. Nevertheless, once mathematics got a minimal hold on the methodology of doing economics, the realism of assumptions seems to have taken a back seat. However, this relegation is not because of any explicit endorsement of instrumentalism. Let me explain. For those of you who have spent any time in a typical mathematics department, or better, if you've taken a graduate mathematics course, you will immediately understand my explanation for what I have just said. That is about there not being any explicit endorsement of instrumentalism when building mathematical models. I have a colleague who has two PhDs. The first one was in mathematics and the other in economics. As he explained to me, too often the culture of the mathematician is that when building a model, one's objective is to construct a proof, and to do so by any means whatsoever. The realism of one's assumptions is not important. What is important is whether or not the proof is logically sufficient, and then, and most important, is whether the proof is deemed to be elegant. Unfortunately, it seems the culture of the mathematician has gotten a significant foothold in today's economics profession. By itself, the invasion of mathematicians' culture would not be enough to explain why today's young model builders' left hands do not know what their right hands are doing. As we economists know, it's all about incentives as well as constraints on achieving one's objectives. For the question at issue concerning the behavior of academic economists, it is all about the criteria behind promotion and tenure. In a debate with the econometrician R.S. Spanos, the historian of economic thought David Collender has addressed this in the context of differences between how European and North American econometric model builders go about constructing their models. One issue is simply the question of what counts for obtaining promotion and tenure. In this regard, most North American universities encourage counting publications, and so Collender identifies this as the main source of the problem I am discussing here. If a model builder has to choose between two different methods of building a model, it would be rational, of course, to choose the model that yields the most and quickest number of publishable papers. In this regard, Collender identifies two distinctly different methodological approaches to building macroeconometric models. On the one hand, there is the European followers of David Henry who supposedly advocate a method which Collender calls general to specific approach. And on the other hand, there is the North American method which Collender calls the theory comes first approach, which is simply the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium approach. The difference between the two methods concerns whether or not one spends a lot of time collecting or assessing data before constructing one's model. The general to specific approach requires spending the needed time. The theory comes first approach instead starts by constructing a model and only then turns to applying it to data. Needless to say, from this perspective, any given model can be applied to many collections of data, and this turns out to allow for the generation of many different papers. So far, there is nothing obvious about this institutional situation that involves ideology. Ideology enters with the easy-to-use theoretical models that can be employed to quickly address an empirical question with an econometric model. Almost always these theoretical models are equilibrium models, and often they are ones that would be accepted only by so-called Chicago School economists. Rarely today will you find an orthodox Keynesian model being built. And by orthodox Keynesian, I do not mean neo-Keynesian models that are almost always general equilibrium models. Instead, I mean those models based on what Keynes had to say in his 1937 Quarterly Journal of Economics article. There he was responding to the critics of his famous 1936 book. He was specifically recognizing the need to see that most, maybe all, participants in the capital investment market lack sufficient knowledge to behave in a textbook maximizer mode. And as such, any presumption of equilibrium is much too unrealistic. About the same time, interestingly, even the Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek argued that any equilibrium-based explanation requires an explanation of how the participants in the market know what they need to know to achieve the equilibrium. By itself, the inclusion of the mathematics culture would not explain the hidden ideology embedded in the economic model building today, although obviously it facilitates Friedman's instrumentalist methodology. And by itself, the urgency of publishing created by the institutional structure of North American universities also does not explain the insidiousness of some underlying ideological presumptions. But when we put them all together, we get a picture I have been trying to paint here. Economic model builders today are engaged in the industry of producing models that satisfy the needs of the institutional structure, but naively are producing models that only can be used to support one particular ideology, namely the ideology that presumes the market by itself can solve all problems, and hence any government activity in the economy is always seen as unnecessary at best and destructive at worst. It is all too easy to see that what can happen under the government leadership of someone like George W. Bush, or anyone who simplistically and uncritically follows the ideological views of the so-called Chicago School economists, and thereby sets about minimizing the role of government. It is now apparent to many observers how easily we can be led to the kind of economic crisis we have been experiencing in the last few years. However, I'm not saying that such a government has to employ only or even any Chicago School trained economists. To the contrary, none of them have to be employed. And all that is needed are a few recently trained PhDs who are very good at model building equilibrium-based econometric models. Despite what I have said so far, I'm not trying to blame the purveyors of econometric model building, nor am I blaming young model builders. This is because all of this has happened behind stage, out of sight, without anyone planning it. Once convenience is put ahead of concern for realism, a lot can happen without anyone designing the outcome. Let me list some of the ways that ideology gets built in. And again, it is without anyone making it a decision to do so. Above all, I am always reminded about how the now common joke about the drunk who lost his keys in the dark part of the street but spends all of his time looking for his keys under the street light because there the light is better. The old joke was designed to be critical comment on the state of economic model building. In particular, it was about using equilibrium models, which are always easier to construct than non-equilibrium models, if for no other reason the mathematics is easier. And then there's the matter I've also already raised. As I said, in the 1960s and 70s, almost all of the faculty at SFU who claimed to be Marxists never read Marx, except maybe the Manifesto, but certainly not Das Kapital. Similarly today, members of the conservative think tanks who promote Adam Smith's views, usually to justify the notion that the market can solve all problems, rarely do they read all of The Wealth of Nations, and particularly not the parts that explain the need for taxes and for government involvement. Interesting, both advocates and critics of mainstream neoclassical economics think that the textbook's theory of the firm shows why a private enterprise is always more efficient than a government-owned firm. Now, I have been teaching microeconomics for most of my career, and I have examined a lot of textbooks. Except for a few that are deliberately promoting an ideological line of argument, The textbook theory of the firm never requires our saying anything about who owns the firm. Here are some textbook examples of the definition of the firm. And as you can see, typically the firm is treated as a black box which transforms inputs into outputs, nothing more. If we go as far back as the 18th century, one could go so far as to say that even Adam Smith's division of labor as a source of production efficiency does not have to say anything about who owns the firm. In the 1980s, I taught a graduate microeconomic theory class during which one of the students who was from Czechoslovakia, was still Czechoslovakia then, explained to us what happened with Dubček's aborted 1968 revolution. For this, he explained how the Central Planning Committee went about organizing the economy in a top-down fashion. It occurred to the class that what he was describing for us sounded an awful lot like how General Motors goes about doing its business of designing and producing automobiles. It also sounded a lot like how SFU was doing business then. In other words, could be even today, I don't know. In other words, despite the ideological claims that major differences exist between private and public enterprises, if one's ideological glasses are removed, it might be that these are distinctions without a difference. One might also see that this is exactly what another Austrian, Joseph Schumpeter, had predicted over 100 years ago. Obviously, by now you can see that I am primarily advocating that model builders should be more concerned with the realism of their assumptions. But of course, some will say we should still allow for a sequential development of models, one that necessarily begins with highly unrealistic assumptions at its early stages. In other words, perhaps model building for model building's sake should be allowed. But I say only if we do not just stop there and admire our beautiful models. Specifically, my concern is that before one starts making policy recommendations to governments, the realism of one's assumptions must be addressed, and that widely unrealistic assumptions must be rejected regardless of their mathematical elegance. A particular concern is the failure to recognize the need to explain how decision makers acquire the needed knowledge they need to have if one is going to assume the existence of an equilibrium or even presume that an equilibrium will be reached in real time. Such a failure is not trivial, particularly since it encourages an ideological perspective that can be very dangerous, as we have seen in the recent years. And then there's the former chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, the once libertarian pro-free market believer, Alan Greenspan. It turns out even he now recognizes this. The question today is, has anyone today learned from Greenspan's admitted mistake about the realism of his assumptions? There we go.
Thank you very much indeed. That was very enlightening. We can now take some questions, and I'd like to start with a question as a theoretical physicist. I'm confused about some statement that you, not statement, but a series of words. You have dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium. Yeah. Dynamic I'm happy with, sort of motion or maybe motion of the market under forces. Stochastic means random. Fine.
Well, no it means they use probabilities.
Yes, well,
okay.
Stochastic actually, well, we use it to mean random, and that, of course.
I know.
General, I'm not sure what you mean by general.
Oh, it's general equilibrium. That has to do with a 19th century economist by the name of Léon Valras, who thought he could explain the whole economy, and he, as a mathematical model, he said all you needed was an equation for everybody's utility function and everybody's production functions. And the question he asked was, can one specify those functions such that there exists at least one set of prices that will clear all markets? That's why it's generated. It's for the whole economy.
Okay, that's very interesting. But why is the term equilibrium even used in economics? I mean, I really worry about that.
I do too, and I've tried to explain this. Economists are confused about it. They use the word equilibrium when they really mean balance. They'll say something that's totally oxymoron. They'll talk about an unstable equilibrium. That's impossible, right? But what they mean is an unstable balance. And an equilibrium for them is a balance that is self-correcting.
Okay, that's fair enough. Maybe they should change their terminology.
I'm working on it.
Great, congratulations. Still, please let me come to the audience now. Would anybody like to ask some questions? I do hope that there are some questions. But please, before you ask the questions, I would like to give you the microphone because this is being taped. We have lots of time for questions.
Hi, this is Amir. My question is that no matter how you build these economic models, then they are used for predictions. So is there a way to test the predictive validity of these models, because they are working on such a large scale that if you rely on the predictions of any of these models,
it depends on which way you're doing. Are you doing it in the North American way or the European way? The North American way, you've designed the model to explain what you've observed. So it'll predict what you observed.
No, but a theory to explain the past cannot be used for future decision making. So this is the validity of a theory is tested when we try to predict future observations, and those that come out of that process successfully are the ones that should survive, like based on my understanding. So, but we cannot try economic models for, testing it in the society, like Mr. Greenspan's test, which failed, that caused $1 trillion loss. So what is the proper way of testing these grand scale models without applying it and seeing, oh, the predictions came wrong?
Testing it without
applying. Like, let's say Greenspan had a theory, an understanding, as he said in the Congress, about the way that world works, which didn't come true.
What Greenspan said is that we shouldn't regulate markets, we shouldn't regulate the banks, we should let them, because if you let the market work, you'll get the best of all possible worlds. That's how they understand Adam Smith.
Good. And it didn't come true.
What he realized is, maybe in some 18th century world that was true, but in the 21st century.
Good. So that theory failed. But this way of testing an understanding of the world is very lossful. Is there a better way?
What?
It causes a lot of loss.
Okay.
In the economy. Yeah. So is there a better way to test economic theories, grand economic theories?
No, my view about it is, because testing is not an easy thing when you're building these elaborate models. As I said, simple ones could require more observations than you can imagine just to come up with one counterexample if it's false. No, I argue, my argument is much simpler. Economists should be humble.
Just you are advocating a grounded approach instead.
No, they should be humble. They should not think they know more than they do.
Okay.
But certainly one of all I'm recommending is, if you're going to advise the government to do things, so I mean, think about what you see in the newspaper. We get the Fraser Institute makes all these great claims, but they never tell you the assumptions they made to get to those things. They've gotten there only because of the assumptions they made. And most of those assumptions are unrealistic. So
you're reminding us to check the validity and correlation of the assumptions.
That's why the title, Realism, right?
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the questions. Are there any other questions, please? Feel free. We have lots of time. This is a broad subject. Surely somebody has some questions.
Half of the audience is my students, and they've already heard all this.
Well, in the other half. Dave. Sorry. Oh, please.
Could you give other examples, maybe? I mean, the Greenspan we know about, but where unrealistic assumptions, and I don't get a lot of, I don't know anything about economics. So what would be other examples where people are putting in unrealistic assumptions that you think, if they thought about it?
Oh, well, as Gord said at the beginning, in my microeconomics that I talk about, I keep challenging economists to tell me how the individual decision maker knows what they need to know in order to choose the best point, as they assume. In almost all cases, if you challenge an economic theorist that way, they will presume that people do it by observation, that is induction. And the problem is, Hume refuted induction in the 18th century. That there is no logic that will allow you to get to their conclusion, their generalizations about what they're facing to make their decisions. All I ask is, if you're going to explain how people go about doing things, you need to explain how they learn what they need to learn in order to make the decisions. So far, part of the problem with equilibrium models is they assume people can do these things, and they all have problems, I say. I don't do applied economics, so I'm not sure what kind of examples I could come up with. He talks loud, you can just...
I mean, the big assumption that...
I should point out that Jim is probably one of the practitioners of what I'm complaining about, right?
No, on the contrary, I'm deeply distressed by the assumptions that are implicit in the Republican way of looking at the world, and a large part of Europe's leadership in looking at what's happening in Europe. And I think that it's something to do with what you just hinted at, that individual decision making is, how did you put it? It's people are, the fundamental Keynesian message, if I may talk about that, is that individual decision making does not lead to a collective
it can, but it doesn't guarantee.
Does not necessarily lead to a collective creation of what you would call balance or equilibrium, or what the Keynesians would call full employment. And the central assumption in the classical way of looking at the world is that wages will fall because people are unemployed and they want to seek employment. The counter assumption is that there must be a collective decision made on their behalf, because the interaction of the individual decisions leads to a market failure. Now, in the European context, I think there's been something very similar, except that it's a collective political failure. And the pursuit of the individual interests of the core states and of the peripheral states, but I would blame the core states, with Germany at the lead, has led to a collective failure of policy. And policy, had it had a collective Eurozone vision 2 or 3 years ago, would have
Jim,
led...
I would go back to the beginning of that, which is, and this was Keynes's point. If you're talking about an investment market, what we hear people, and Greenspan was one of those, who would say if there was problem with the economy going down, what you should do is lower the interest rate, and that will, all these investors will go out and invest in companies so they could expand. And all that Keynes said was that what smart businessman would, in a world where they see it going down, is going to go off and invest more in their company? That's just crazy. But that's exactly what they're doing in these examples you were talking about, is the notion that people will, if you lower the price, they'll buy more. It's nonsense. Look at the price of houses in the U.S. They're lowering the price, but the people aren't buying more. But that's one of the assumptions made, behavioral assumptions made, that is simply false. But what I tell my students, as they will tell you, is that what we talk about in mainstream economics that we teach is like middle-class economics. It never has the extremes. And all that Keynes was talking about is, in the 1930s, we had an extreme. You can't be applying these things that work in normal times to these extreme times.
Yeah, I mean, the failure of regulation under Greenspan.
There was a question way back up here in the corner that was going to...
My question is a little bit vague, but I was listening to the Prime Minister of Iceland, and he had a conscious decision to make whether to save the democracy or save the financial system. and he chose to save democracy, which no one else did. And I was wondering if you could comment on that, and I'm not quite sure where that fits into your discussion.
Yeah,
of
I'm
models.
not sure either. I don't see how it would fit in that. Certainly, thinking that the sort of Adam Smith view that this is all the machinery, it's going to run no matter what, is begging a lot.
So a question from an economics geographer. We watch from a distance, sometimes with horror.
My daughter's a geographer, so I.
But of course, the language is important here. So when economists say theory, I think, okay, Keynes, Smith, and I think and often it comes out as a mathematical model.
Well, no, there was what happened in the 1970s is that all of a sudden they collapsed those. Theory became mathematics models. And then
when you say empirics, I'm sort of thinking, okay, what does that mean? And then I understand that in economics there's been this turn towards true empiricism in the sense of natural experiments and lots of differencing and so on in the way observations are taken. So reflecting on your talk, I'd be interested in your comments. Have these natural experiment approach to empirical economics or maybe you call it applied economics, has that solved the logic problem, or has that introduced a whole new set of
the lab experiments that economists do?
Oh no, not lab experiments. I'm thinking of Mariel boatlift. The Mariel boatlift, David Card's paper. Cubans arriving in the Miami labor market.
Rubio. That one? That fellow? I still don't know what you're talking about. Sorry. I guess I should.
Maybe some of the economists who are up to date on this this empirical turn.
No. I'm a theorist, so I'm humble. I don't try to do this to
my understanding is that in economics there's been a turn to looking for what are called natural experiments, which is trying to make observations of changes that are exogenous and dramatic.
No, but that's what econometrics does all the time. It assesses if one of its exogenous variables changes, then you compare what was before with what was after.
And you you would extend your critique to that methodology as well. That's the core of my question.
I'm talking about building the econometric models that you would use to do that.
I think I'll ask as right of organizer, droit d'organisateur, see we have French here, I would like to ask the last question, sure. Which is the following. I had a colleague called Per Bach, who is unfortunately not with us anymore. He was a very aggressive, maybe too aggressive physicist, unlike myself. And what he did is he thought of a sandpile model. Sandpile has an interesting criticality. You build up a sandpile. At a sudden point, the sand starts rolling off, a sort of organized criticality. And he used this model to do things like analyze earthquakes, and he also analyzed the stock market. And one of the things he found was that the noise in the stock market, which is known as 1/f noise, indicated that the stock market wasn't, at least I guess, not micro predictability, but long-term predictability was impossible. I'm wondering if you could make some comments about that.
Well, my finance colleagues consider stock market data noise to start out with. Yeah. No, they only really look at like prices either at the end of the week or at the end of the month.
It's very local.
What we keep seeing every day at BNN, they could care less about that. That doesn't matter.
So this is actually
yeah, they don't use that day-to-day data to do any kind of thing. No.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for the questions. This has been a very exciting lecture, and thank the speaker as well. So could we thank the speaker again?